Right, ladies and gentlemen, our next session is the world in 2020. Is a recession coming? Can we have a round of applause for our esteemed group of panelists? Mr. Krishnamurthy Subramanian, Chief Economic Advisor, Government of India. Mr. Subhash Chandra Garg, Power Secretary, Government of India. Mr. Omkar Goswami, Indian Economist. Mr. Puneet Chhatwal from Indian Hotels. And the session will be moderated by Ms. Shereen Bhan, Managing Editor, CNBC TV 18. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you very much. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and thanks very much for joining us here. I think this promises to be an exciting session because we're not just going to be talking about India, we're also going to talk about the outlook for the global economy in 2020. Let's just set the context, and let me start by talking about the world. And let me throw some data your way, and this is courtesy Ruchir Sharma, the author of Breakout Nations and the Rise and Fall of Nations, the emerging market head at Morgan Stanley. And Ruchir says in his latest report that not one major country is growing as fast today as it was in the last decade. Not one is growing faster than 10%, the rate China and other miracle economies sustained for years on end during the post-war golden age between 1950 and 2007. Now here's why, perhaps. The 4 Ds, that's deglobalization, demographics, debt, and declining productivity. These have been buffeting the global economy since the crisis of 2008, but now these are the factors that are probably contributing to the decline that we're seeing. More data. Germany is one of at least 5 major economies on the verge of a recession, which basically means that they've seen 2 straight quarters of negative growth. And the question then is that do we now need to do a reset? Do we now need to redefine the way that we look at growth itself? Is 5 the new 7? Is 4 emerging market economies? And what is the prescription then that policymakers need to adopt, need to follow? Let's talk a little bit about India. And I think Ravi Shankar Prasad, just before our session started, talked about the fact that there is discomfort in the economy, that not too much should be made of the discomfort in the economy. We've just seen the budget being presented, and barely a month after the budget presentation, we're now seeing industry queuing up, seeking more from the government by way of intervention, saying that, look, we need government intervention to be able to beat the slowdown. So let's start by talking a little bit about India, and let me get the Chief Economic Advisor, Krishnamurthy Subramanian, to give us a little sense about where things currently stand. How bad is the slowdown? Is there a need for fiscal stimulus or not?
Some very loaded questions there.
Not loaded, a straight question actually.
So the first point I want to make is, you know, as you rightly said, in an economy which is a global economy where other countries are struggling to grow at, let's say, 2.5%. Let's acknowledge that India continues to, you know, remain the bright spot, even with, let's say, you know, a little bit of a decrease in the growth rate. So that's the number one point. Second, I think we have to be a little careful. So I've always felt that we in India tend to oscillate between either irrational exuberance or excessive pessimism. For instance, around 2008, 2009, we seem to be pretending that, you know, we don't need to do anything, you know, just a normal course will grow at 8-9%. That clearly was not the truth. Nor is basically some of the pessimism now, I think, is true. For instance, let me sort of finish that point. There was a good article in the Economic Times on Saturday, which looked at various sectors, you know, and showed that while there are some sectors that are actually not doing that well, there are other sectors which are doing very well as well. And I think we have to be a little bit more careful when we, you know. And this is something I always actually try and tell my students. There are 3 A's that we need to be careful about: the anecdotes, the aggregates, and the averages.
Yeah.
You know, when you just look at anecdotes, oftentimes you indulge in bad thinking. Good thinking is about looking at averages and aggregates.
Okay.
And when you look at in the aggregate, you look at sectors that are doing well, rather than just focusing on the anecdotes of some sectors that are not doing that well. I think you get a much better perspective. So that's something that we have to absolutely acknowledge.
Okay.
Now, your second question about the fiscal stimulus. Now, here's where I think we have to be careful. Starting around 1991 now, we're a market economy. in a market economy, there are sectors that actually go through a sunrise phase and then through a sunset phase. I think, if we basically expect the government to sort of use taxpayer money to sort of intervene every time when there are basically, let's say, some sunset, then I think you introduce possible moral hazard from too big to fail,
Okay.
and as well as the possibility of a situation where profits are private and losses are socialized, which is basically completely anathema to the way a market economy works.
Okay.
So these are some critical factors that we must keep in mind. A couple of other just observations that I want to make. There's often a talk about, let's say, the automobile sector or the real estate sector. Some of the difficulties there sort of symptomatic of the economy. I think you have to be careful here because yesterday's very nice op-ed by Dr. Arvind Panagaria in the Times of India, where he's talked about how the automobile sector, given the kind of customs duties that there are, there are inherent issues. Together with that, there's disruption that is coming in various forms, be it the Ola, Uber phenomenon.
Sure.
Be it the fact that, today for the younger generation, a car is not necessarily a status symbol. To that, you also add the disruption that's coming from EVs. Now, none of these necessarily have to do with the economy. So you've got to be careful to say that let's say some of the what's happening in the auto sector is necessarily symptomatic of the economy. I think that's not very sort of very precise, and that's why we have to be looking at aggregates, not just at anecdotes.
Okay, I'll get to aggregates in just a second, but I just want to labor on what you said, and you brought up the auto sector as an example and the real estate sector as an example, both sectors where there is a significant unsold inventory problem as well. And you're absolutely right that some of it is perhaps on the part of industry's own shortcomings, and perhaps some of it is to do with disruption as well as the general momentum in the economy. So if I were to read between the lines, you're basically saying that no intervention is required today.
I'm not going to give any more weight to what you're trying to read between the lines. I've stated what I've stated in terms of the principles that we must go about. I think the operationalization of those principles is something that we'll have to wait for.
Okay, the operationalizations of the principles, but I think if I were to read between the lines, and it's fairly clear that you're suggesting that a fiscal stimulus, at least for certain sectors at this point in time, may not necessarily be warranted. Let me come to the former Finance Secretary, Mr. Garg. What is the problem today, to your mind? And, to pick up on what the Chief Economic Advisor stated, that it's important not just to look at anecdotes, it's also important to look at aggregates. Now, let's take a look at some of the aggregate data. Investments by corporate firms that filed annual returns between 2010-11 to 16-17 as a percentage of GDP has gone from 15% to 10.5% to 10.2% to 9.8%, 9%, 7.5%, and now 2.7%. That's the aggregate story. What's the picture looking like from here on? And why do you believe that we are in this situation where the aggregate tells us this story?
I think this session is basically on the global growth.
I said we'll start by talking about India and then we'll get to the world.
I would come to India also, but let me just give you, because that's the wider setting.
Yeah.
India is part of the global
Sure.
story, right? So today the global economy still is growing at about 2.9% to 3%. Even global, there is no recession.
Yeah.
There is no, and last 2 years we grew at about 3.5%, 3.6% globally. In that context, this is a little bit of slowdown. But if you take 4 years before that, the average growth was only 2.4, 2.5%.
Yeah.
So this year's growth globally would be higher than the growth of 6 to 7 years taken together as an average. So let us not be too much, let me say, the media especially tends to somehow, and Chief Economic Advisor also referred to that, overblow the story of slowdown and things like that. Number one,
Sir, it's not the media that's queuing up at North Block meeting the Prime Minister as well as Nirmala Sitharaman, the Finance Minister. It's industry that's telling the government that we're in pain. So, I don't know if it's accurate to blame the media for this.
No, it's not blame. Somehow our mindset, we tend to either feel little more depressed than what the fact of the situation would warrant. So globally, to my mind, there is no recession.
Sure.
It's unlikely. The topic suggested what's going to happen
Yeah.
in 2020. I don't think that situation is anywhere near that. So now let me come to
Yeah.
India now, in terms of aggregates and also. Some numbers you read out about the corporate tax growth and corporate turnover growth in the
Right.
bottom line. Last year, the first quarter happened to be the best of the lot. Indian economy grew at 8.2%. Corporates' profits were also much higher. I think it was about 20% along. Even this was reflected in our tax revenues also. So last year, the tax growth in the first quarter was something close to 18 to 20%. Right? This year, the first quarter happens to be the quarter where there was a lot of election-related work.
Yeah. Yeah.
There was a slowdown from the government expenditure. This year, the first quarter, the government was in cash balances, which is very unusual. Government expenditure came down
Yeah.
from something like 32% of the yearly budget
Yeah.
to something like 25, 26%. All these factors had taken a little bit of a toll on the first quarter. So let us not, the first quarter's number are likely to come
Right.
31st. It might come around 5.5 to 6%. People might treat that as another evidence of a big slowdown. It's not.
Okay.
We will need to root it into the reality of what the first quarter this year is in comparison to the first quarter of last year.
So would you then also concur that at this point in time there is no need for a fiscal stimulus, which is the expectation? And if not, then, and this is a cyclical phenomena that we're going through, what are the kind of counter-cyclical measures that you would
Let
expect?
me again put this into some context. I don't know why, but for some reason, in the last 3 years which I have seen, so it is 2019, 18 and 17, the quarter of July to September has been one of the quarters where slowdown was most prominently in the news. Right. In 2017, it was because of the IBC and the GST having been introduced.
Yeah.
So the production was much less in the first quarter, which was reflected. I remember very clearly 2 years back in the same months, there was all the time a lot of talk about slowdown, stimulus and other kind of things.
Okay.
Last year, we may not forget last year, thanks to oil price rise, etc.
Right.
Everywhere in the media, this was that the forget fiscal deficit, the current account was going down so badly, etc. So you need to do. Again this year, this quarter happens to be the one where there is a lot of talk.
Okay.
I think the sentiment will change.
Okay.
And we should need to take a very careful decision that is the fiscal stimulus based on additional borrowings from the market and cutting down the access to the private sector, the funds.
Right.
We have a problem with the rate mechanism.
Yeah.
We don't have the transmission very efficiently.
Yeah.
If you further borrow, further reduce, the transmission will not take place.
Absolutely.
And secondly, what works better? The rate reduction in the interest rate to the private people, availability of credit to the private people. Is that a better way rather than the stimulus?
Okay.
I think we don't debate that very much.
Okay.
Last three quarters, or three weeks, the bond rates have gone up by about 25 basis points. I think this will hurt industry much more than anything like this. So we need to debate what is the best way to do it. I think, in my judgment, the better way mechanism to support the industry is to bring down the rate of interest, make the credit grow to them. That is a much better way, to my mind, to stimulus rather than the
versus a fiscal stimulus. Well, I think both of you are on the same page. Omkar Goswami, before we talk a little bit about the world, let's finish the conversation around what India needs to do at this point in time. And clearly, this is a balancing act for policymakers given the fiscal constraints. What, to your mind, should be the policy prescription?
I'm both fortunate and unfortunate that I don't work for government. So I can say some things which people who work for government are naturally constrained. And I appreciate their constraints. Let me start by spending a couple of minutes saying that it's not a recession. Firstly,
Yeah.
we use this term, Shereen, so loosely in India that I've not seen anywhere else. Recession everywhere, by and large, is 2 successive
Quarters of negative growth.
negative
Yeah.
growth.
Yeah.
But people use the word recession in India at the drop of a hat. It is a slowdown
Yes.
in growth. And let me just make my points. It's the real question to ask, is this a cyclical slowdown? That is, it's going down, it may go down 1 more quarter, and then it'll be all okay.
Yeah.
Slowly it'll come back again. Or is it something more structural? I don't think we have a clear answer to this. Those who are in favor of saying, no, it's a cycle, we are on a down cycle in growth, but we'll come back again soon enough in a quarter or 2 and then go back onto the up cycle, don't know what they're saying. And those who are saying 100% it is structural also don't have enough data. But there are some very worrying structural-like signs in the economy. And I'm going to mention 3. One is, it's quite amazing that for the last 22 years, not a short period of time, the share of manufacturing to GDP
Yeah.
has remained stubborn and constant at 15%.
Right.
So nothing has happened in terms of increasing the share of manufacturing to GDP. Second is, as of now, a large number of industries that make up the index of industrial production are seeing a slowdown. The third is, despite a huge liquidity, amount of liquidity in the banking system, it is, as far as public sector banks are concerned, it is very difficult to get the kind of borrowings that are needed. It's very tight because the banks are very scared of lending. But fourth, I'm going to mention 2 issues which are very, very important. As far as we are concerned, if you go forward for the next 20 years, the literacy of the population between 18 and 24, which is the age group of people coming in, we are way off the curve completely compared to Southeast Asia, compared to China, compared to East Asia, compared to a large number of countries with whom one way or the other we compete. And also, as far as the share of women in the workforce is concerned, it's low and it's falling.
Yeah.
So if you want to take the longer and the shorter term things, I think we are possibly in the beginning of a structural situation. It's not a pure business cycle, and it may take longer to come out of than we think. As far as stimulus is concerned, we can wish for all the fiscal stimulus that we have, but the fisc is broke. Simple as that. When I take away the public sector borrowing requirements from the exchequer, when I look at the slowing of the rate of growth of tax coming in this year, the fisc is broke. So unless they want to break the fiscal deficit, I'm not a fiscal deficit fetishist, but unless they want to break the fiscal deficit that they've set onto themselves, they don't have no cash.
Absolutely, and that raises the issue that Mr. Garg raised, that if you do in fact do that, if you do exceed the fiscal deficit target, then what is it going to mean in terms of borrowing costs? And then we're back to square one, not trying to address. But just to pick up on the point, and then I'll come to you, Puneet, in just a second, to get you to comment on what we just heard there from Omkar, that this seems to be the start of a structural slowdown, not necessarily just a cyclical one.
Let me qualify this very. There is no certainty that it is. But there are enough lights that are showing amber.
So I do want to, present a different view on the same aspect. While I do think there is a structural element, while Omkar is actually viewing the structural element in a negative way, I actually look at it in a lot more positive. And
Okay.
here's why. So if you look at it from the 2009 to 2014 period, and not just that period, but I think that was sort of a culmination of some habits that had crept up, which is basically one of which was, very meager equity in the corporations, use of sort of features like borrowing debt in the subsidiaries, putting it as equity in parents, putting up your basically shares as collateral. So there's effectively the extent of equity in the system, and just the way business was getting done. I think there were bad habits that actually had not only crept in but had actually gotten accentuated.
Fair point.
So this ramp up in the in leverage, corporate leverage and capacity, which happened over almost a 6 to 8 year period, the unwinding of that actually cannot happen in an instant. It is something. So we are still sort of undergoing the overhang of that.
Yeah.
But what I look at it as a very, very important point is that we are in the process of trying to actually reduce and eliminate some of these bad habits. And I'll give you one specific example. I cannot imagine a market economy which basically which would have a credit culture without a bankruptcy code.
Yeah.
The introduction of the bankruptcy code not only has it reduced basically the NPAs by 3 lakh crores, and here's where again the aggregates versus anecdotes is very important to focus on. But let me not get distracted by that. What is also important is, given the threat now of actually, if a project does not do very well, that a promoter may face the risk of that company, of losing control over that company. The way capital budgeting gets done is something that actually requires a lot more, expertise. And remember, such expertise does not get built overnight. Earlier, you could actually put some numbers on the Excel sheet, not worry about it, because anyway, ex post, if things didn't work out, there are other mechanisms to.
Yeah.
But today, you actually have to go and do that capital budgeting exercise very carefully. You have to actually, so there is this process of bringing in some good habits, which actually is going on.
Okay.
And therefore it makes me a lot more sanguine that the structural part that is accounting for the slowdown is something that will lead us to sort of better times. Because otherwise, see, one of the key things I look at is, in our case, actually growth sort of went too far ahead of the checks and balances that we built in.
Okay.
And in the absence of those checks and balances, the governance, you always have a system where you accelerate and then you have to hit speed breaker and then decelerate for a long period. If you have to grow in a sustained manner, and I think crises across the globe really illustrate that without actually proper governance, you cannot grow in a sustained manner, because the quality of credit is as important as the quantity.
So the short-term pain you're saying is something that
Absolutely.
we're going to have to face. Puneet, let me ask you, because you have a sense of the Indian market as well as what's happening globally. And as I pointed out, consumption data continues to actually drive growth, whether it's the US economy or here in India. Of course, this has started to decelerate as well. But what's the outlook now as far as global growth is concerned, as well as the outlook for India?
So Shereen, one thing is common, sitting on a panel in India or sitting globally, what you hear from the experts is, this quarter or that growth figure or the consumption number is less bad than we actually interpret it to be. So whether it's the headlines, whether we call it the anecdotes, or we call it the, whatever, the 3 A's or the 3 C's or the 4 D's. That just made me think, sitting here, of definitely an anecdote which I would say we should all start getting used to be a very simple thing. The less bad is the new good. And, the world is, I think, in a very simple terms, I'm not an economist and I don't know what I'm doing on this panel, but I'm very happy and privileged to be a part of this. I think there is a permanent damage to the pricing power in all sectors of the globe. We are not having the same ability to charge as we used to have earlier.
Okay.
And that, whether it's cyclical or structural, I don't think I can share so much, but definitely it is sentimental.
Okay.
It's not that there is dearth of capital in the world. There is more liquidity or private equity in the market than maybe ever before.
Yes.
But there is a reluctance to invest. And I think a sentiment is very important. A belief is very important.
Yeah.
And as far as India is concerned, I remain very optimistic that eventually everything will be fine. There are headwinds, but the nature of the nation is such. I think Mr. Munjal said it.
Yes.
It's a young democratic nation of 73 years
Yeah.
and a civilization. I would just call it a young civilization. This is a young civilization which has the determination and will to grow, and I think we will get through this phase of this quarter, or April to September, or October to March, and eventually it will be fine.
Okay, eventually it'll be fine. But let me pick up on that point that was being made there. And 2018 was in fact a bumper year when it comes to private equity, not just here in India, but globally as well. The kind of money that has come in from private equity, the kind of large transactions that have happened. But since we're talking about the global picture, Mr. Garg, and we talked about the fact that post-2008, we're now in an era of deglobalization. You're also seeing shrinking of populations across the globe, productivity. What does this now mean in terms of how policymakers need to approach the new rate of growth? And what is that going to be? And should the focus then be more on per capita as opposed to anything else?
I think we need to view the world in a different way now. The world of 2020s is very different than the world of 1980s or 1990s. Just look at the broad, big picture. The global economy is about $90 trillion today, right? Something like 60 trillion of the global GDP is in countries which are what you referred earlier, Ruchir Sharma's demography,
Yeah.
savings. These are the countries which are not going to grow beyond 2%. I mean, this is such a 40 years back or 30 years back, these were the growth engines of
Yeah.
the world. The US, the EU, the Japans and
Yeah.
other things, right? So 60 out of 90 trillion, if it is expected to grow only at about 2% and
yeah.
not, or maybe 50, then you have a second set of countries, let us say including China, which had its heyday, right? And they were growing very fast, 10% over 30 years,
Yeah.
amazing growth. Now have reached to a stage
6%.
where they're slowing down.
Yeah.
And they would slow. They would slow to 5% or something, or 4%, and go in times to come. This leaves out another 20, $25 billion, right? The rest of the world, which is only about 10 to 15 billion dollars, or trillion dollars, so $1 trillion, is the world which will grow in future. Right? South Asia, where we are sitting, today is only about $3.5 trillion economy. In 20 years to 25 years, if we do well,
Yeah.
this should be $20 trillion economy. Right? Can we plan and do
Yeah.
right? Africa today, which is less than $2 trillion economy,
Yeah.
should be another $5 to $7 trillion economy in 20 years.
Fair point.
The rest of the emerging market, even some of the emerging market like Russia, Brazil and others, have also gone into that trap. They will not grow.
Yeah.
But then there are Indonesia of the world who will grow. Can we think of, when a lot of time we talk about export-led model, everybody has grown
Yeah.
by exporting to
Yeah.
these. The new growing countries will not grow by exporting to this block, right? They will need to create markets in South Asia, in Africa, in the rest of the emerging markets. That requires a very different kind of strategy and outlook. And there is enough demand, there is enough of that which can drive a lot of growth in our part of the world. Can we seize that?
Okay.
I think if that is the way we see the world today,
Okay.
in a very different light,
Sure.
then we will probably have many, many years of
Of-
very good growth.
Very good growth. Puneet, very quick. Yeah.
Sorry, I just want to kind of add or maybe throw a question for the specialist here. Can we just keep looking at a figure of 3% growth in the Western economies? Because when we used to look at 4, 4.5, or 6,
Yeah.
the inflation was at also double the level than today. The interest rates were at 7 to 8 to 10%. Today
Yeah.
they are in the negative range.
Yes.
So I do believe there is a structural shift globally. And if somebody read about the bonds issued by Germany or Denmark,
Yeah.
with a zero coupon and a zero subscription,
Right.
I think we are going through a very different cycle in the world,
Yeah.
which we cannot understand with the figures of yesterday.
Sure. No, I think you make a valid point. Yeah, go ahead.
This is the same symptom. So $16 trillion of global bonds in the negative. Germans issued $2 billion of bonds, hardly subscribed. But they had the audacity to issue 30-year bond at zero rate of interest.
Yeah.
What does this indicate? This indicates that those economies, that which I was referring to,
Yeah.
had a lot of investable funds but no investment opportunities.
Yeah.
They will not grow. But can that money be brought
To India.
this world?
Yeah, absolutely. To countries like India. You're absolutely right. Omkar, I want to come to you now. And you know, let's be clear that there is a global reset that is underway. And whether we talk about what's happening with central bank policies, what we're seeing happen with bond deals, what we're seeing happen globally with interest rates, and the investable opportunities emerging economies like India throw up. How do we, to quote Subhash Chandra Garg, seize the opportunity in this global reset?
Let me just put it this in very straightforward terms, and I'm not going to answer your question the way you framed it. I am putting this bluntly. The gains that we have had from reforms starting from 1991 and subsequent reforms that occurred, I think are coming to an end. And those gains gave us 7% plus growth rates. Those gains gave us, for 3 years, 9% growth rate. In the situation of the global economy as it is today, and other issues within India, those gains are coming to an end. If you want to break out, now there are two options. We can get to a new equilibrium of 5%.
Yeah.
And that'll continue. There'll be no problem with a 5%.
Yeah.
I promise you. I mean, as long as Indians can walk, we'll get 5% growth rate. Yeah. So, but is that sufficient? Is there enough to lift still a very large number of people out of the poverty line and
Yes.
create the kind of consumptions that they need? And the answer is no. So if we want to jack that growth rate by 1% point, from 5% to 6% over a 15-year period or a 10-year period going forward, not 7, 6%, I think we have to sit down, Mr. Modi, Mr. Shah, and whoever else, have to sit down and seriously think of what are the fundamental second-generation reforms which we have talked about a lot but
Yeah.
never did. That time has come, and we can't keep on fiddling around, talking about it and not doing. And then he has the opportunity to do it now. If he doesn't do it in the next 6 months, at least start it off. He loses the game.
The three things, Omkar Goswami, before I get the CEA to comment on that, the three things that you believe that the Prime Minister and the Home Minister, along with the Finance Minister, need to sit down and move quickly on.
First, I think there is absolutely, I mean, if the ministries can show in an honest way, it's very difficult to do it in this period because of the shorter year, but in an honest way can systematically increase the pace of disinvestment, it will give a clear signal. Absolutely clear signal. Second, it's not an easy thing to do, and that play will take longer, is to have a uniform labor code.
Yeah.
It's not easy to do,
Yeah.
and eventually it's a state subject, they have to accept it.
Right.
So I'm saying start with these two at least.
Okay. Well, at least in disinvestment, the intention has been made
I've
clear.
heard this
I
intention,
know.
Shereen. I've heard this intention from the time the cow was conceived, born, and didn't come home. Chodo ye intention.
Okay.
So let me actually, there was talk about consumption, there was talk about sentiment. So let me try and hopefully bring some clarity to
Yes.
what do we need to do. And this is something the first chapter of the economic survey we try to do.
Yes.
This. See, economies are complex systems, and the question that you have to ask is it that sentiment drives consumption, or is it consumption that drives sentiment?
Yeah.
Is it investment that drives consumption, or basically there are many variables that are co-moving at the
Sure.
same time. And therefore, the exercise that we did is when we sat down, actually said, okay, let's look at countries after the Second World War.
Yeah.
We put two filters saying, a country has to be growing at least 5% plus
Yeah.
over a 10-year period.
Yes.
And said these, we got a set of countries and said, which included China, Southeast Asia, etc. What is that one thing that these countries did which basically enabled them to grow at 5% plus over a sustained period of time?
Yeah.
And the answer there is very, very clear. And actually, this is not an opinion that I'm actually peddling. It is based on very careful evidence that we've gathered and we've actually put together in the
Yeah.
survey. It is investment.
Yes.
And therefore it is, by looking at the Western economies today, and which basically depend on consumption, one of the key things that clearly stands out is that once you're about a $10,000 above that per capita,
Yeah.
then consumption can actually be relied on for growth. But for economies at the stage at which we are,
Yes.
and the evidence, I think, is very, very clear. Investment, especially private sector investment. And let me now add to, I think, what
But
Omkar...
I don't think anyone's arguing
No,
with
let me-
that. I think the case for investment, and specifically private sector investment, has been made ad nauseum. The question, though, is what will it take for the private sector
I-
investment to pick up? We've been talking
I
about
agree,
these animal
Shereen,
spirits being unleashed for a long time. When and how will they be
Correct, but
unleashed?
this is
Yeah.
what I'm saying is important, because oftentimes you keep hearing, there's basically, investment is not happening because consumption is not there,
Yeah.
or sentiments are not there. I think this clarity that, let's not, among 100 different variables, let's just focus on investment. That's where I'm going to, come to the points that Omkar made. The reforms that we have to do, the next generation,
Yeah.
have to actually be focused exactly on investment,
Right.
on encouraging investment. And I think here's where the labor reforms that Omkar spoken about actually are important. The disinvestment, and I think, his frustration, at basically the execution not being fast enough,
Yeah.
is something that I think, must be taken on board. These are two critical signals that can go out, which says that, okay, the government really is, is, and I can tell you that there is clear seriousness on this to push on both of those. So the bottom line is that it has to be, let's not get cluttered around, and economic systems can create that clutter, but just keep the eyeball on investment,
Yeah.
and do everything that it takes to actually just encourage investment. And that's the bottom line.
Okay, if that is the bottom line, Mr. Garg, then what needs to be done to get the investment cycle moving again? We've talked about this chicken and egg situation, this virtuous cycle that we're hoping to get started, but what needs to be done? And again, going back to the point that Omkar was making, for 20 plus years, share of manufacturing to GDP has stayed put at 15%. We've had this aspiration of 25% for a decade plus now. So if investment is the number one priority, what is it going to take for us to move on it?
So investment is the key to growth. I think that that cannot be disputed. But how do you get the investment going and moving in the Indian economy is the point. I think besides the broader macro issues, which we sometimes discuss, the labor and land and other kind of reforms, I think we need to now get into very specific sectors and then look at very closely how to do it. Let me illustrate for
Yeah.
an example. We have a lot of coal in the country, right? But we require about 1,000 million metric tons of coal every year. We produce only about 600 million tons, right? We import a lot of coal today. What is required to be done to make sure that we produce 1,100 million tons, right? That requires a lot of investment. And how that investment will come, it will not come until the Coal India has the monopoly of investment in the coal, right? Probably what we need to do, in my judgment, is to award coal blocks of 100 million ton annual mining capacity
Yeah.
to 5 big
Private sector companies.
Yes.
This was the intention. It was a stated
No,
objective.
So this is the way. Now we have a law. We have created a law also where commercial mining is to be permitted. So all that it requires in this sector is to make sure that we award this. Right.
So,
That is
so
you can-
unless you break the public sector monopolies, the fact that you have a stated policy that allows for the private sector
So-
to get in, what will it take to,
So that is-
to truly get this
so
off
that
the
is
ground?
exactly the reform required. Reform is there, but that reform requires implementation. That you need to create 5 blocks of 100 million ton capacity each and award it to the best of the companies in the world with the idea that you should start producing the coal in next 2 years. That's it. So we will need to do, you go through oil and
You make it sound simple, sir, yet it hasn't happened. My
That's-
question is, with this political mandate, if it can't happen, then what will make it happen?
so it is that which is required to be done. You go to another sector, oil and gas, railways, roads. Roads, for example, let
Yeah.
us take. See, this was one sector where private investment had started coming in quite a lot. Right? We had the animal spirits running where lots of roads were taken by giving the subsidy to the government rather
Yeah.
than taking it. Right? So they were not only funding cost.
Yeah.
But over the years, the road situation has changed completely. Today it requires 25 crores to build a kilometer of road. The revenue which comes on the road is less than 1 crore.
Yeah.
No private sector will invest
Yeah.
in this. We'll have to change the model of road.
Yeah.
Right. So what we require in our economy to make investments actually happen is to go by sector, do the analysis, and come out with the appropriate measures and take those decisions to do it. Broader,
Subhash, I just want to add one thing. And this is my last words. One thing that we have to stop, particularly in policy making decisions, is a phrase which always starts the sentence, which is called "but in a country like India, ... If we stop this "but in a country like India, ... we can think of policies
Yeah.
which are obvious, staring at us in the eye,
Yeah.
and stopped by "but in a country like India, ...
Sir, if
I
may-
would second that. I think this is...
Sorry, can I just add something because I'm dying to say this?
Please go ahead.
We're sitting under the roof of Taj Palace Hotel.
Nice plug, by the
We
way.
are
Go
talking
ahead.
about the coal industry. Let's talk about the tourism industry, the biggest multiplicator of the jobs. Every job created in hotel sector creates 6 to 10 jobs in other sectors.
Yeah.
We have a young population in India.
Yes.
Let's look at the GST of not charging at 100 euros, 28%.
There you go.
No country in the globe is doing
Another pitch for a GST rate
I mean,
cut, this time from the hotel
If
industry.
for nothing else, as being the only panelist from tourism, let's please support it for the change.
Okay, you have our sympathies.
exactly. So you have again a tourism sector to think about.
Yeah.
Education sector to think about.
Yeah.
Right. Tourism has amazing. We spend something like 29
Yeah.
billion dollars on the tourist going from India.
Yeah,
We get 1/3 of that in India. We
Yeah.
are a civilization of 5,000 years.
yes,
The kind of tourist experience which we can create for the world is amazing.
yeah.
The number of tourists which come to India are 1/3 of what visit Louvre every year.
Yeah.
What are we doing? We can find again that what I was trying to say, that we have to do sector by sector analysis.
And
Yes.
we are making our contribution. We invested heavily to revive the Connaught, which will open in February in this city.
Na-
We created a new destination like Havelock in Andaman.
We'll do a whole other forum on tourism. I promise
I must
you.
actually-
But we're unfortunately completely out
Sharon,
of time.
this has
Yes.
to be said actually.
Yes.
I think, the starting and ending with tax, I think, I want to therefore take a place like Gaya, for instance, right?
Yeah.
Both Gaya.
Yeah.
You know, even if you give basically a tax rate cut, if there isn't an airport there actually which enables people to come in,
Yeah.
I think, you know, we basically need to move on beyond these and say, what are those, you know, enablers actually in infrastructure,
Yeah.
and identifying places and say, these are the 50 places where we basically will create the enabling infrastructure.
Right.
I think this you know, sort of extraordinary focus on tax needs to actually move on to other aspects as well.
Okay, needs to move on to other aspects as well. Unfortunately, we're completely out of time. Let me give everyone exactly 10 seconds. Omkar Goswami, 10 seconds. The single biggest priority that we need to focus on, not just in the short term, whether this is structural, cyclical, etc., but to make India find its place in this global reset.
The second generation reforms that have been always spoken about but have never come.
Ditto.
Besides investment, I think let's also focus on the digital economy, which is the future. We have a lot of things to do it. Currently, we are not as good. We have less than 1% of the
Yeah.
global digital economy.
Yeah.
China is 42%. I think we'll have to get our act right in there also.
Yes.
Besides investment.
Okay, Puneet.
Aspiration to be a global leader.
Aspiration to be a global leader. Well, I think a lot of the solutions that we've talked about, a lot of the policy prescription that's been discussed here on the panel is not something new necessarily. These are ideas that we've spoken of, debated for very, very long. I think the question now is, when are we actually going to get a lot of this moving, and how quickly will we finally see the bullet being bitten on some of these ideas as well as policy prescription. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us here to talk about the world in 2020 and India's place in it. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us here this afternoon.
Thank you. I would request you all to please be seated. If the panelists could please be seated, there's a polling which will happen right now. So, ladies and gentlemen, the question that is going to come for you right over here, if you can see, if it continues, the US-China trade war will push the world towards a recession. Please press A if you agree, press B if you disagree, and C if you can't say anything. Once you enter your option, just press it once, leave your voting pad on the table itself, and in 30 seconds we will come up with our answer. Every session will be followed by a special polling with a question like this, and in 30 seconds we will get to see the result. If you haven't pressed, please press A for agree, B for disagree, and C for can't say. All right, there you go with the answers. 40.2% agree, 46.08 disagree, and C is 13.73%. Okay. With that being said, let's have a huge round of applause for our esteemed group of panelists, and our moderator would request Mr. Suman Khan Munjal to kindly grace the stage and present a summit memo to the panelists and our moderator. Welcome, sir. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.